The morning mist clung to the scarred landscape of Picardy like the breath of ghosts, and in that ethereal silence before dawn on May 28, 1918, Major General Robert Lee Bullard stood at the edge of what would become America's baptism by fire. The village of Cantigny, little more than rubble and memories now, lay ahead in the German lines of prize that would either herald the arrival of American military might or serve as a tombstone for the nation's martial ambitions. The American expeditionary forces had been in France for nearly a year, yet they remained largely untested in major offensive operations, while British and French divisions bled themselves white in the trenches. The doughboys of the 1st Division trained, waited, and endured the skeptical glances of their European allies. General John Joseph Pershing's insistence on maintaining American units as independent fighting forces, rather than feeding them piecemeal into Allied commands, had created tension, but it had also preserved the integrity of American military doctrine. Now, with the German spring offensive threatening to break the Allied lines, the time for proving American mettle had arrived. Cantigny itself held little strategic value. Beyond its symbolic importance, the village sat on a slight rise in the otherwise flat Picardy countryside, offering observation over the surrounding terrain. German forces had occupied it since 1914, transforming its stone buildings into fortified positions and its cellars into machine gun nests. What made Cantigny significant was not its tactical worth, but what its capture would represent. The first independent American offensive operation of the Great War, the 28th Infantry Regiment, commanded by Colonel Hanson Edward Ely, had been selected for this honor. These men, many of whom had never seen combat, carried the weight of national expectation on their shoulders. They represented the New World's answer to the Old World's catastrophe, fresh troops arriving to tip the balance in a war that had already consumed millions of lives. Their faces, still unmarked by the particular exhaustion that came from months in the trenches, reflected a mixture of determination and apprehension that their officers recognized, but dared not acknowledge aloud. The preliminary bombardment had been planned with mathematical precision. French artillery, supplemented by American guns, would pulverize the German positions for 40 minutes before the infantry advanced. The coordination required between the various Allied units represented a diplomatic as well as military achievement, as French commanders had initially been reluctant to entrust such firepower to support an untested American assault. As Bullard surveyed the terrain through his field glasses, he understood that the eyes of two continents were upon them. Success at Cantigny would validate President Woodrow Wilson's decision to enter the war, and Pershing's strategy of maintaining American independence. Failure would provide ammunition for those who argued that American forces should be integrated into experienced European commands rather than attempting independent operations. The men of the 28th Infantry moved through their final preparations with the methodical care of soldiers who understood they were about to cross a threshold from which there would be no return. They checked their Springfield rifles, adjusted their equipment, and shared the quiet words that soldiers have always exchanged before battle. In a few hours, they would either be heroes or casualties, but they would no longer be untested. The village of Cantigny waited in the gray dawnlight, its ruins holding secrets that only American blood would unlock. Colonel Hanson Edward Ely moved through the forward trenches like a specter in the pre-dawn darkness, his boots splashing through the accumulated water that never seemed to drain. From these excavated wounds in the earth, the men of his 28th Infantry Regiment crouched in the muddy channels, their faces pale in the dim light filtering through the cloud cover. Each soldier bore the particular tension of troops about to face their first major engagement, a tightness around the eyes that no amount of training could fully prepare them for. The French artillery officers had worked through the night, calculating ranges and coordinating timing with a precision that spoke to 4 years of bitter experience. Captain Marcel Dubois, the French liaison officer attached to the American force, had expressed cautious optimism about the bombardment plan, though Ely could detect the skepticism beneath his diplomatic courtesy. The French had seen too many promising offensives founder on the realities of modern warfare to invest much hope in any single operation. At exactly 4:45 on the morning of May 28th, the earth convulsed as over 300 guns opened fire simultaneously. The sound was unlike anything the American soldiers had experienced, not merely loud, but a physical force that seemed to reshape the very air around them. The German positions at Cantigny disappeared behind a wall of smoke and flame, as high explosive shells tore into buildings that had already been reduced to skeletal frames. By previous bombardments, Lieutenant Colonel George Marshall, serving as operations officer for the 1st Division, had insisted on precise timing for the artillery preparation. 40 minutes of concentrated fire would, in theory, neutralize German resistance without giving the enemy time to bring up reserves or organize a coherent defense. The bombardment lifted at 5:25, creating a sudden silence that felt almost supernatural after the sustained thunder of the guns. The whistle blast that signaled the advance seemed almost anticlimactic after the artillery barrage. Men who had been pressed against the forward walls of their trenches by the concussion of friendly fire now hauled themselves over the parapet and began walking toward the German lines. The pace was deliberate, rather than rushed. Lessons learned from earlier Allied disasters had emphasized the importance of maintaining formation and coordination, rather than allowing individual enthusiasm to fragment the attack. As reported in a contemporary dispatch from war correspondent Frederick Palmer, the advancing Americans presented a sight that would have seemed impossible 4 years ago. Fresh troops moving across no man's land with the confidence of veterans. The doughboys advanced in extended lines, their bayonets fixed and their rifles held at the ready, covering the 400 yards to the German positions with a steadiness that impressed even their French observers. The German response was initially sporadic. Machine gun nests that had survived the bombardment opened fire from unexpected angles, forcing the attacking Americans to take cover and maneuver around strong points, rather than advancing in neat lines. Private First Class Samuel Woodfill of Company M distinguished himself by single-handedly eliminating 3 machine gun positions, actions that would later earn him the Medal of Honor, though at the time he was simply another soldier doing whatever was necessary to keep moving forward. Captain Clarence Hubner's company encountered the heaviest resistance. As they approached the village center, German troops, many of them veterans of the Eastern Front, had taken advantage of the stone construction to create interlocking fields of fire that could sweep the approaches to Cantigny. The American advance slowed as platoon leaders assessed the situation and adapted their tactics to the specific challenges they faced. By 6:15, advanced elements of the 28th Infantry had reached the outskirts of Cantigny proper. The village that had appeared so formidable from a distance revealed itself to be a collection of ruins held by determined but outnumbered defenders. The real test would come not in taking the village, but in holding it against the inevitable German counterattack. The ruins of Cantigny revealed themselves to be more fortress than village. As the American troops picked their way through the debris-choked streets, what had once been homes and shops now served as interconnected strong points, with German machine gunners positioned to command every approach. Sergeant Alvin York, though he would achieve greater fame later at the Meuse-Argonne, demonstrated the tactical innovation that would characterize American infantry tactics throughout the war by leading his squad in a flanking maneuver that neutralized a particularly troublesome position overlooking the main street. Company commanders quickly discovered that the preliminary bombardment, while devastating in appearance, had failed to eliminate many of the German defensive positions. The enemy had learned to shelter their automatic weapons in cellars and reinforced positions that could survive all but direct hits from heavy artillery. Lieutenant Robert Patterson's platoon found themselves pinned down by enfilading fire from a machine gun nest concealed in what had been the village church, its bell tower providing an elevated position that dominated the surrounding area. The fighting devolved into the brutal house-to-house combat that had characterized urban warfare since the beginning of the conflict. American soldiers, many of whom had been farmers and factory workers just months before, adapted to this new environment with a pragmatism that impressed their officers. They used hand grenades to clear rooms, rifle fire to suppress German positions, and bayonets in the close quarters fighting that erupted whenever defenders attempted to fall back to secondary positions. Captain Theodore Roosevelt Jr., son of the former president and commanding officer of Company A, led by example as his men worked their way through the village center. His leadership style, combining personal courage with tactical awareness, embodied the American approach to combat that emphasized individual initiative within a framework of unit cohesion. When his company encountered a particularly stubborn German stronghold in the ruins of the town hall, Roosevelt personally led the assault that finally dislodged the defenders. By 7:30, the American flag flew over the center of Cantigny, though isolated pockets of German resistance continued to hold out in the surrounding buildings. The capture of the village represented only the first phase of the operation, holding it against the expected counterattack would prove far more challenging than taking it in the first place. Colonel Ely established his command post in the remains of the village school, positioning himself where he could coordinate the defense while maintaining communication with division headquarters. The German response was swift and predictable. Artillery fire began falling on Cantigny within minutes of the American occupation, as enemy observers directed accurate fire on positions they knew intimately. The bombardment was particularly effective because the Germans had pre-registered their guns on key points throughout the village during their 4 years of occupation, allowing them to place devastating fire on any position the Americans might attempt to fortify. Private Joseph Atkinson of Company K found himself separated from his unit during the German bombardment and took shelter in a partially collapsed cellar when German infantry began infiltrating back into the village under cover of their artillery fire. Atkinson single-handedly held a crucial intersection for over an hour, using his Springfield rifle to pick off enemy soldiers attempting to advance through the rubble. His actions, though unrecognized at the time, exemplified the individual courage that would characterize American performance throughout the day. As documented in the official history of the 1st Division, the German counterattack began in earnest at 8:45, with elements of the 18th German Division advancing from prepared positions to the north and east of the village. The assault came in waves, with each group of attackers attempting to exploit gaps in the American defensive line that had been hastily established among the ruins. The inexperienced American troops found themselves facing seasoned German veterans, who understood both the terrain and the tactics necessary for successful urban combat. The morning sun, when it finally broke through the cloud cover, illuminated a scene of controlled chaos as American and German forces engaged in deadly combat among the ruins of a French village that had become the symbol of American military capability. The German counterattack struck Cantigny with the fury of a summer thunderstorm, concentrated and devastating in its intensity. Elements of the 18th German Division, veterans of campaigns from Verdun to the Eastern Front, advanced through the morning mist with the methodical precision of soldiers who had perfected the art of recapturing lost ground. Their assault came from 3 directions simultaneously, designed to overwhelm the hastily established American defensive positions and drive the inexperienced doughboys back across no man's land. In confusion and defeat, Major Theodore Roosevelt Jr. found his Company A under assault from German stormtroopers, advancing through the rubble of the village's eastern edge. These elite troops, armed with light machine guns and satchel charges, represented the finest infantry the German army could field. They moved in small groups, using the cover of destroyed buildings to approach American positions before launching sudden, violent assaults designed to create gaps in the defensive line. Roosevelt's men, many of whom were engaging in sustained combat for the first time, responded with a tenacity that surprised even their own officers. The American defensive plan, hastily conceived but effectively implemented, relied on creating interlocking fields of fire among the ruins rather than attempting to hold fixed positions. Sergeant Major Daniel Edwards positioned his machine gun teams in locations that could support each other while covering the most likely avenues of German approach. This tactical flexibility proved crucial, as German assault teams repeatedly found their advances channeled into killing zones, where American firepower could be concentrated most effectively. Lieutenant Colonel George Marshall, observing the battle from the division command post, noted the particular effectiveness of American rifle fire in urban combat. The Springfield rifles carried by the doughboys proved superior to German weapons in the precision shooting required for house-to-house fighting, allowing American marksmen to engage enemy soldiers at ranges where automatic weapons were less effective. Private First Class Charles Whittlesey, positioned in the bell tower of the damaged church, accounted for 17 confirmed German casualties during the morning's fighting. The most critical moment of the battle came at 10:15, when German forces succeeded in penetrating the American perimeter near the village cemetery. A gap had opened between Company B and Company C when a particularly intense artillery barrage forced both units to seek cover, allowing the German assault team to infiltrate deep into the American position. Captain James Harbert, commanding the reserve company, led an immediate counterattack that restored the defensive line, though at considerable cost and casualties, according to war correspondent Richard Harding Davis, who observed the battle from French lines, the sight of American soldiers, many still beardless boys from farms and cities across the Atlantic, standing firm against veteran German assault troops, represented a transformation of American military capability that few had thought possible. The doughboys were learning the harsh lessons of modern warfare under the most demanding circumstances, and their performance exceeded the expectations of both allies and enemies. The German bombardment continued throughout the morning, with enemy artillery attempting to isolate Cantigny from American reinforcement while supporting the infantry assaults. The accuracy of German fire, based on 4 years of intimate knowledge of the terrain, made movement within the village extremely hazardous. American casualties mounted steadily as soldiers were forced to expose themselves to maintain defensive positions or carry wounded comrades to aid stations established in the most protected cellars. By 11:30, the German attacks had begun to lose their initial momentum. The combination of American rifle fire, machine gun positions, and artillery support from French guns had taken a steady toll on the attacking forces. More importantly, the American troops had demonstrated that they would not break under pressure, a psychological factor that began to influence German tactical decisions. The stormtroopers, who had advanced with such confidence in the early morning, now found themselves engaged in a grinding battle of attrition against opponents who showed no inclination to yield ground. The morning phase of the Battle of Cantigny was drawing to a close, but both sides understood that the afternoon would bring renewed German efforts to retake the village that had become a symbol of American military credibility. The noon sun beat down mercilessly on the smoke-shrouded ruins of Cantigny as both American and German forces used the temporary lull in fighting to reorganize their positions and tend to their wounded. The morning's combat had established that the doughboys of the 28th Infantry would not be easily dislodged from their hard-won positions, but German commanders remained determined to retake the village before nightfall. The afternoon would bring the most severe test yet of American resolve and tactical capability. General Oskar von Hutier, commanding the German forces in the sector, had earned his reputation through innovative infiltration tactics that had proven devastatingly effective against Russian and Italian armies. His afternoon assault plan called for a more sophisticated approach than the morning's frontal attacks, utilizing small groups of stormtroopers to penetrate American positions while artillery fire isolated different sections of the defense for mutual support. The German general understood that failure to retake Cantigny would represent more than a tactical defeat. It would signal to the world that American forces had arrived as a serious military factor. Colonel Hanson Edward Ely had spent the brief respite repositioning his forces to meet the expected renewed assault. The morning's fighting had revealed weak points in the American defensive scheme, particularly in the coordination between different companies and the integration of supporting weapons. Ely's experience as a professional soldier proved invaluable, as he adapted textbook defensive principles to the specific challenges of holding a ruined village. Against determined counterattack, the German afternoon offensive began at 1300 hours with a concentrated artillery barrage that exceeded the morning's bombardment in both intensity and accuracy. Enemy observers, positioned in concealed locations surrounding Cantigny, directed fire with devastating precision onto American positions that had been identified. During the morning's fighting, the bombardment continued for 30 minutes, turning already damaged buildings into piles of rubble and forcing American defenders to take shelter in whatever cover remained available. Captain Clarence Huber, whose company had borne the brunt of the morning's assault, found his position under attack from a new direction as German stormtroopers approached through a communication trench that connected Cantigny to enemy positions in the north. The trench, previously unknown to American intelligence, allowed German forces to approach within grenade range before being detected. Huber's quick thinking in repositioning a machine gun team to enfilade the trench approach prevented what could have been a catastrophic breakthrough. The afternoon fighting differed markedly from the morning's more conventional assaults. German tactics emphasized speed and surprise, with small groups attempting to overwhelm isolated American positions before support could arrive. This approach initially proved effective in several locations, forcing American platoon leaders to adapt their defensive methods to counter an enemy who refused to present concentrated targets for American firepower. As documented in the official War Diary of the 1st Division, Private Samuel Jackson of Company L performed acts of heroism that exemplified the transformation of American soldiers under combat pressure. When his squad leader was wounded during a German infiltration attempt, Jackson assumed command and led a counterattack that not only repelled the immediate threat, but also captured valuable intelligence about German tactical methods. His actions, repeated by dozens of other young Americans throughout the afternoon, demonstrated that the doughboys were learning to fight with the same professional competence as their European counterparts. The most significant German effort came at 15:30 when the companies of stormtroopers launched a coordinated assault on the American positions near the village center. The attack, supported by accurate mortar fire and preceded by a smoke screen, initially achieved considerable success in penetrating American defensive lines. For nearly an hour, the outcome of the entire battle hung in the balance as German forces established positions within 50 yards of Colonel Ellie's command post. The crisis was resolved through the intervention of Company D, which had been held in reserve specifically for such an emergency. Captain Theodore Roosevelt Jr. led his men in a fierce counterattack that drove the German infiltrators back through the village streets in bitter hand-to-hand combat. The fighting was so intense that both sides suffered heavy casualties in exchanges that sometimes came down to bayonet work among the ruins of what had once been peaceful homes. By 1600 hours, the German afternoon offensive had been definitively repulsed, though at considerable cost to both sides. The American hold on Cantigny had been tested to its limits and had proven unbreakable. As evening approached on May 28th, the village of Cantigny bore little resemblance to the objective that American forces had assaulted 12 hours earlier. The accumulated damage from artillery bombardments, small arms fire, and explosive charges had reduced most structures to skeletal frameworks of stone and timber. Yet among these ruins, the soldiers of the 28th Infantry Regiment had established a defensive position that German forces had proven unable to breach despite repeated and increasingly desperate attempts. The tactical situation by 1700 hours presented both opportunities and challenges for the American commanders. German forces remained in strength on three sides of the village, their positions reinforced throughout the day as enemy commanders committed additional resources to retaking what had become a symbol of their military reputation. Intelligence reports indicated that German artillery had been repositioned to support a potential night attack, while enemy infantry units were being reinforced with fresh troops drawn from quiet sectors of the front. Colonel Hanson Edward Ely used the relative quiet of early evening to consolidate his defensive positions and establish more effective communication links between his scattered companies. The morning's fighting had revealed significant gaps in American tactical doctrine regarding urban combat, particularly in the coordination between infantry and supporting weapons. Ellie's afternoon adjustments had addressed the most critical deficiencies, but he remained concerned about his unit's ability to withstand a sustained night assault by experienced German forces. The medical situation presented particular challenges as evening approached. American casualties had been heavier than anticipated, with over 100 men killed or wounded during the day's fighting. The Battalion 8 station, established in the cellar of what had been the village bakery, was overwhelmed with wounded soldiers requiring immediate attention. Captain William Porter, the battalion surgeon, had performed surgery under combat conditions that tested both his medical skills and personal courage as German artillery continued to target any building showing signs of American occupation. Supply and ammunition concerns also weighed heavily on American commanders as darkness approached. The intense fighting had consumed far more small arms ammunition than pre-battle estimates had projected, particularly rifle cartridges used in the precision shooting that had proven so effective against German assault teams. Machine gun ammunition was also running low, forcing squad leaders to husband their automatic weapons fire for only the most critical situations. French artillery support, which had proven crucial throughout the day, faced its own logistical challenges as evening approached. The guns supporting the American attack had fired continuously for over 12 hours, with some pieces approaching their mechanical limits. Ammunition supplies, while adequate, required careful management to ensure continued support throughout what promised to be a difficult night. Captain Marcel Dubois, the French liaison officer, worked closely with American forward observers to coordinate fires that would interdict German reinforcement routes, while conserving ammunition for defensive purposes. The psychological dimension of the battle had evolved significantly throughout the day. The morning's uncertainty about American capabilities had given way to grudging respect from both German opponents and French allies. As noted in a contemporary dispatch by war correspondent Arthur Roll, the sight of young Americans, many barely out of their teens, holding ground against veteran German assault troops has transformed perceptions of American military potential. The doughboys themselves had undergone their own transformation. The morning's nervousness replaced by the quiet confidence That comes from having been tested in combat and found adequate to the challenge. German preparations for a night attack were clearly visible from American observation posts. As enemy troops moved supplies forward and repositioned supporting weapons, the attack, when it came, would likely represent the most serious challenge yet to American defensive capabilities. Night fighting presented particular difficulties for inexperienced troops, as the confusion and disorientation of darkness often proved more demoralizing than enemy fire. Colonel Ellie's evening preparations reflected both the lessons learned during the day's fighting and the specific challenges anticipated during night combat. Machine gun positions were relocated to provide interlocking fields of fire across approaches that would be invisible in darkness, while rifle positions were established to provide supporting fire for automatic weapons teams. The defensive plan emphasized communication and coordination, recognizing that successful night defense required even greater unit cohesion than daylight operations. As twilight deepened over the contested village, both sides prepared for what would prove to be the climactic phase of America's first independent offensive operation of the Great War. The German night attack began at 2200 hours with a precision that spoke to 4 years of experience in nocturnal warfare. Unlike the daylight assaults that had preceded it, this offensive relied on stealth and surprise rather than overwhelming firepower. German stormtroopers, their boots wrapped in cloth to muffle sound, infiltrated American positions through approaches that had been carefully reconnoitered during the day's fighting. The attack represented General von Hütter's final attempt to retake Cantigny before daybreak brought renewed Allied artillery support and the possibility of American reinforcement. The initial phases of the night assault achieved considerable success against American positions that were still adapting to the challenges of defensive warfare in darkness. German infiltration teams succeeded in penetrating the perimeter at several points, creating gaps in the defensive line that threatened to fragment American resistance. The confusion inevitable in night combat worked to German advantage, as experienced stormtroopers exploited their familiarity with night fighting techniques against opponents who were encountering such conditions for the first time. Captain Theodore Roosevelt Jr.'s company bore the brunt of the most determined German assault, as enemy forces attempted to establish a foothold in the village center that could serve as a base for expanding their penetration. The fighting that erupted around the ruins of the town hall was particularly intense, with opposing forces sometimes engaging at ranges measured in feet rather than yards. American soldiers, many of whom had never experienced combat in complete darkness, learned to fight by sound and muzzle flash as much as by sight. The crisis of the night battle came at 23:30, when German forces succeeded in overrunning the American command post, forcing Colonel Ely and his staff to evacuate to a secondary position. For nearly an hour, the outcome of the entire operation remained in doubt as German forces consolidated their hold on the village center, while American companies found themselves isolated and unable to coordinate their defensive efforts effectively. The turning point came through the initiative of individual American soldiers who refused to surrender positions they had fought so hard to capture. Sergeant Alvin Cullum York, though he would achieve greater fame in later battles, demonstrated the leadership qualities that would make him legendary by organizing a counterattack that recaptured the command post and restored American control over the village center. Similar acts of courage and initiative throughout the American positions gradually turned the tide against the German assault. As documented in the regimental history compiled after the war, the period between midnight at 0300 hours represented the most severe test of American military capability. In the European theater, the doughboys of the 28th Infantry, many of whom had been civilians less than a year earlier, demonstrated that they possessed the individual courage and unit cohesion necessary to withstand the most determined enemy assault. Their performance during these critical hours established American military credibility in a way that no amount of training or preparation could have achieved. The German withdrawal began shortly after 3 in the morning, as enemy commanders recognized that their final attempt to retake Cantigny had failed. The stormtroopers, who had penetrated deepest into American positions, found themselves isolated and unable to exploit their initial success. Faced with the prospect of being cut off and destroyed by an American counterattack at dawn, German forces began pulling back to their original positions under cover of darkness. Dawn on May 29th revealed the full extent of American success at Cantigny. The village, though reduced to rubble by the intense fighting, remained firmly in American hands. German casualties, while difficult to calculate precisely, had been severe enough to convince enemy commanders that further attacks would be prohibitively expensive. More importantly, the Battle of Cantigny had established beyond doubt that American forces could fight effectively as independent units rather than merely supplementing Allied operations. The strategic significance of the American victory extended far beyond the tactical importance of holding a small French village, as noted in contemporary newspaper accounts, including a front-page story in the New York Times. The Battle of Cantigny marked America's emergence as a major military power, capable of conducting independent operations against the finest European armies. The psychological impact on both German and Allied planning would influence military decisions. For the remainder of the war, for the soldiers of the 28th Infantry Regiment, the successful defense of Cantigny represented a transformation. From untested recruits to proven combat veterans, they had faced the ultimate test of military capability and had emerged victorious, establishing a foundation of confidence and competence that would serve American forces. Throughout the remaining months of the Great War, the village of Cantigny, virtually destroyed in the fighting, had become the birthplace of American military prestige in the 20th century. This account draws upon official military records, contemporary newspaper reports, and memoirs of participants, including particularly valuable details from war correspondent reports filed during and immediately after the battle. The transformation of American military capability demonstrated at Cantigny would prove to be one of the decisive factors in the eventual Allied victory. In the Great War,